In 1936, a divorced woman becoming queen was so unthinkable that a king gave up the throne rather than test it. In 2022, a divorced woman became queen anyway. So, what actually changed? That's not a rhetorical question. There's an answer, and the answer has specific dates, specific names, specific votes, and a specific PR strategy with a nickname. But to see it clearly, we have to start with what the Crown actually did to Edward VIII. Not the love story version, not the romantic tragedy, the institutional version, the cold one. On December 10, 1936, Edward VIII signed the Instrument of Abdication at Fort Belvedere. The following day, the Declaration of Abdication Act received Royal Assent, and he ceased to be king. He'd reigned for 326 days. The reason given, publicly, repeatedly, in every official communication, was that he intended to marry Wallis Simpson, and the British monarchy had declared this impossible. Not unwise, not unpopular, impossible. 3 men formed the wall he couldn't breach. Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, told Edward directly in a series of audiences at Buckingham Palace through November 1936 that the British public would not accept Wallis as queen, and that his government would resign rather than support the marriage. This wasn't an idle threat. No alternative government willing to back Edward could have been formed. A constitutional crisis, manufactured with precision, aimed squarely at one man's personal life. Cosmo Gordon Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was publicly and vocally insistent that Edward must go. And 2 days after the abdication, on December 13, 1936, Lang delivered a radio broadcast so savage in its moral condemnation that it inspired Gerald Bullett's widely circulated verse, "My Lord Archbishop, what a scold you are, / and when your man is down, how bold you are." The Archbishop didn't just oppose the marriage, he twisted the knife on the way out. And the prime ministers of every dominion, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, the Irish Free State, were formally consulted under the conventions of the Statute of Westminster. With the partial exception of Ireland's Éamon de Valera, every single one confirmed that a marriage to Mrs. Simpson was unacceptable. The constitutional machinery was unanimous, and it was merciless. But Edward didn't go down without a fight. And the fight proved something important about the thesis. This was never a clean application of constitutional law. It was a political brawl, and Baldwin won it. Winston Churchill, then a backbencher in the political wilderness, years from his wartime prime ministership, tried to rally support for the king. He urged Edward to delay, to refuse to act under pressure, to buy time so that public sympathy might harden into political leverage. Churchill was joined by press barons Lord Beaverbrook, owner of the Daily Express, and Lord Rothermere, owner of the Daily Mail, both of whom were willing to use their newspapers to build what became known as the King's Party, an informal faction that believed Edward should be allowed to marry Wallis and remain on the throne. The idea was that if the king simply refused to sign anything, and if enough public and parliamentary pressure could be marshaled, Baldwin's government would blink first. It was a genuine political countermove, not some fringe fantasy, but a calculation backed by 2 of the most powerful media proprietors in Britain. Baldwin destroyed it. He outmaneuvered Churchill in the House of Commons on December 7, 1936, when Churchill rose to plead for delay and was shouted down by members of his own party. The humiliation was total. Churchill later called it the worst parliamentary reception of his career. Beaverbrook and Rothermere's press campaign never gained traction because the other major newspapers, The Times, the BBC, had already lined up behind Baldwin's position. The King's Party collapsed in days, not because the constitutional argument was unanswerable, but because Baldwin was a better political operator than anyone on the other side. Edward lost his throne the way people lose political fights, not because the law demanded it, but because the other side had more votes, better tactics, and a tighter grip on the media narrative. The justification wasn't just political, though. It was theological. The king is the supreme governor of the Church of England. In 1936, the Church's position on the remarriage of divorced persons was absolute. It was forbidden. Canon law held that marriage was a lifelong, indissoluble union. The Church would not solemnize, bless, or recognize a second marriage while a former spouse still lived. And Wallis Simpson's situation was doubly disqualifying. She'd been divorced not once, but twice. First, from Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr., a U.S. Navy aviator she'd married in 1916 and divorced in 1927. And then from Ernest Aldrich Simpson, a British-American businessman whose divorce from Wallis wasn't even made absolute until April 1937, months after the abdication itself. The Supreme Governor of the Church of England could not, in conscience or in law, marry a woman the Church considered still bound by a prior sacrament. That was the argument. That was the weapon. Edward tried to find another way through. He proposed a morganatic marriage, an arrangement in which Wallis would become his legal wife, but wouldn't share his rank or title, wouldn't be queen, wouldn't even be styled Her Royal Highness. It was, by any honest measure, a significant concession from a sitting king. He was offering to marry the woman he loved on terms that officially diminished her. Baldwin took the proposal to the Dominion governments. They rejected it. The cabinet concurred. The morganatic compromise was dead before it had any chance to breathe, killed not by constitutional impossibility, but by political unwillingness, by men who'd already decided the outcome and were going through the procedural motions. So Edward chose Wallis, and the crown made him pay. He was given the title Duke of Windsor. Then, on May 27, 1937, letters patent were issued restricting his royal style to himself alone. Wallis would be denied the style Her Royal Highness. Deliberately. Permanently. This wasn't a bureaucratic oversight or an obscure point of protocol. It was a surgical act of cruelty aimed at the woman who was, according to everyone who mattered, the problem. But the HRH denial was only the beginning of the punishment. The financial arrangements were equally vindictive. Edward had owned Balmoral Castle and Sandringham House as private property. They'd been personal possessions of the sovereign, not crown estates. After the abdication, he was pressured into selling both properties to his brother, the new King George VI. The sale price was reportedly well below market value, and the proceeds were effectively the seed money for his exile, because the alternative, staying in Britain without a home, without an income, without a role, was no alternative at all. George VI provided Edward with a financial allowance, but it came with strings attached, functioning less as fraternal generosity and more as a leash. The money kept flowing as long as Edward stayed away, stayed quiet, and didn't embarrass the institution. There were further humiliations over the disposition of royal jewels, pieces that Edward believed were rightfully his, inherited from Queen Alexandra and Queen Mary, which the palace claimed for the crown. The disputes dragged on for years, petty and granular, and designed to remind Edward at every turn of what he'd given up and what could still be taken. Edward would spend the remaining 36 years of his life in effective exile, mostly in Paris, holding his diminished title and nursing a wound that never fully healed. He died there on May 28, 1972. Wallis never received the HRH. The rule was presented as ironclad, as doctrine, as God's own law, delivered through the Archbishop and enforced by the machinery of the British state. Keep that word, doctrine, in mind. It doesn't survive the next 70 years intact. But before we get to that, a quick correction. Because if this script is going to ask you to question the monarchy's language, it should start by questioning the monarchy's language. You've probably heard the Queen Mother described as a commoner who married into the royal family. The Crown, and plenty of documentaries, lean on this framing. A commoner. As if Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was some shopgirl who caught a prince's eye. Here's what commoner actually means in British peerage law. Anyone who doesn't personally hold a peerage title. That's it. The daughter of an earl is a commoner because the title belongs to her father, not to her. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's father was Claude Bowes-Lyon, the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, a Scottish nobleman. The family seat was Glamis Castle, a 14th-century fortress in Angus, Scotland, where the Bowes-Lyon family had held sway since 1372. One of the most storied estates in Britain, legendary as the setting of Shakespeare's Macbeth. Elizabeth grew up splitting her time between Glamis and St. Paul's Waldenbury, the family's Hertfordshire country house, attended by governesses, educated privately, presented at court, moving entirely within the circles of the upper aristocracy from the day she was born. To call her a commoner, in any ordinary sense of the word, is absurd. It's exactly as absurd as calling Lady Diana Spencer a commoner. Diana, daughter of the 8th Earl Spencer, who grew up at Althorpe House, a 13,000-acre estate in Northamptonshire. The word commoner makes it sound like the royal family occasionally plucks ordinary women from obscurity, a Cinderella story that flatters the institution. The reality is that the British royal family has, for generations, married almost exclusively within a tiny closed circle of aristocratic families and European royalty, and then described those marriages as evidence of its openness. The terminology isn't innocent. It's a branding exercise, and that instinct for self-serving language is going to matter enormously when we reach phrases like Queen Consort and Princess Consort later on. Now, a question that comes up constantly and nobody seems to have a clean answer for: why didn't the Queen Mother walk behind George VI the way Prince Philip walked behind Elizabeth II? The short answer is that there isn't a single letters patent or formal protocol document that says, the consort walks behind the sovereign. What exists is a principle of precedence. The sovereign walks first, always. Everyone else follows. Philip walked behind Elizabeth II not because he was a consort specifically, but because she was the sovereign, and everyone walks behind the sovereign. That part is consistent. But here's where it gets gendered and interesting. A queen consort held a recognized, centuries-old ceremonial role with its own historical weight. The title queen, even queen consort, carried automatic symbolic authority that stretched back through centuries of precedent. Queens consort were crowned at coronations. They sat in positions of honor at state occasions. They walked beside the king as something close to ceremonial equals. A prince consort? That was an awkward, almost improvised designation with no deep roots. Prince Albert only received the title Prince Consort in 1857, 20 years into his marriage to Queen Victoria. And even then, it was by letters patent rather than any ancient tradition. Philip was never formally titled Prince Consort at all. He was the Duke of Edinburgh, and his precedence was established by separate letters patent from Elizabeth in 1952, giving him place preeminent after the Queen. The asymmetry was stark. A queen consort occupied a role that centuries of tradition had defined and dignified, while a prince consort navigated an ambiguous, almost improvised space, always visually subordinate, always walking a step behind, not because a rule demanded it, because no tradition existed to elevate him. The rules weren't consistently applied because they weren't really rules. They were conventions, gendered ones, made up as the institution went along, which brings us back to the doctrine that destroyed Edward's reign, because that doctrine made up as the institution went along, too. Here's the timeline. In 1936, the Church of England's ban on remarriage after divorce was the theological bedrock that Archbishop Lang used to justify removing a king. Immovable, eternal, God's law. In 1955, the same weapon was aimed at Princess Margaret. She'd fallen in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a decorated RAF fighter pilot who served as an equerry to her father George VI and later to Elizabeth II. Townsend was a divorced man. His former wife, Rosemary, was still living. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, any descendant of George II under the age of 25 needed the sovereign's consent to marry. Margaret had been waiting. The plan, not exactly secret, was that once she turned 25, she could marry without the Queen's permission, provided she gave 12 months' notice to the Privy Council and Parliament didn't object within that window. She turned 25 on August 21st, 1955. The escape hatch was right there, but the establishment closed it. The government made clear that if Margaret married Townsend, she'd likely have to renounce her place in the line of succession, forfeit her civil list income, and potentially leave Britain. The Church's position hadn't moved an inch. And so, on October 31st, 1955, Margaret issued a public statement so carefully worded it read like a surrender document. Mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others. Here's the part that makes the blood boil. Public opinion actually supported Margaret. Polling at the time showed clear majorities in favor of allowing the marriage. The British public had watched this woman be denied happiness by the same institutional machinery that had denied her uncle his throne 19 years earlier, and they thought it was wrong. The government and the Church overrode public opinion, not the other way around. In 1936, Baldwin had argued that the people would never accept it. In 1955, the people would have accepted it, and the institution said no anyway. The excuse shifted, but the outcome was identical. Two members of the same family sacrificed on the same altar, a generation apart. And the British public was starting to notice the pattern. Then society moved. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1937, passed just months after the abdication, in a timing that shouldn't be lost on anyone, broadened the grounds for civil divorce beyond adultery alone. The Divorce Reform Act of 1969 introduced irretrievable breakdown of marriage as grounds for divorce, taking effect in 1971. Divorce rates in England and Wales climbed sharply. Suddenly, the Church of England had divorced and remarried congregants filling its pews every Sunday, dropping money in its collections, raising their children in its faith. The immovable doctrine was becoming increasingly, visibly awkward. In 1978, a formal motion was put to the General Synod to allow divorced persons to remarry in church with the permission of their diocesan bishop. This was the first serious internal attempt to change the very policy that had been wielded against Edward VIII 42 years earlier. It failed, but narrowly and revealingly. It lost specifically in the House of Clergy, rather than being overwhelmingly rejected across all three houses. The bishops were ready, the laity were ready, the clergy weren't. Yet. The motion was sent out to the dioceses for further consultation, a procedural move that kept the question alive rather than burying it. The crack in the foundation was visible now, even if the building hadn't fallen. And then came 2002. In July 2002, the General Synod debated and approved a document titled Marriage in Church After Divorce, formally published as GS 1449. which established new guidance granting individual clergy the discretion to solemnize the marriages of divorced persons in church. The vote wasn't close. House of Bishops, 27-1. House of Clergy, the same house that had blocked the 1978 proposal, 143-44. House of Laity, 138-65. Read those numbers again. 27-1. The guidance was carefully framed not as a reversal of doctrine, but as pastoral accommodation. The Church maintained its official witness against divorce and remarriage in general, while simultaneously creating a formal mechanism by which remarriage could happen in its buildings, conducted by its clergy, with its blessing. Clergy were given a checklist of questions to consider. Does the couple understand that divorce is a breach of God's will for marriage? Is there evidence of repentance? Do they have a mature view of what went wrong? The theological fig leaf was preserved. Barely. The timing is everything. In 1936, the Church's position was cited as the immovable object that shattered Edward's reign. In 2002, that same Church voted by crushing margins to let divorced people remarry in its churches, and the vote happened 3 years before Charles and Camilla's wedding. A doctrine presented as God's own law in 1936 turned out, 66 years later, to be a policy. Updatable by a show of hands. At Church House, Westminster. And most of the British public barely noticed. No abdication, no exile, no savage radio broadcast from the Archbishop shaming anyone into submission. Just a committee vote. And a king who'd lost everything for nothing. Now let's talk about the woman who connects both eras. Elizabeth II was 9 years old when Edward abdicated, old enough, biographers have noted, to understand that something enormous and frightening had happened to her family. The abdication was the foundational event of her life. It was the reason her father became King George VI, the reason she became heir presumptive, and ultimately, the reason she became queen. The rule about divorced women didn't merely affect her family, it created her reign. And it was Elizabeth II who dismantled it. Not all at once, not willingly at first. The early period is defined by refusal. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, Elizabeth reportedly refused to acknowledge Camilla Parker Bowles or permit her presence at royal events. The reasons were layered: personal loyalty to Diana, institutional horror at the damage the affair was inflicting on the monarchy's public standing, and, according to multiple biographers, including Penny Junor, a visceral personal aversion. Elizabeth is reported to have referred to Camilla as that wicked woman in private, though like all reported royal private remarks, it comes through intermediaries and must be treated as sourced but unconfirmable. What's documented is the structural exclusion. Camilla wasn't invited to royal events, wasn't received at the palace, was treated as though she simply didn't exist in any official capacity. When the Camilla-gate tapes were published by the press in January 1993, the damage went nuclear. These weren't vague rumors. This was a recorded, intimate phone conversation between Charles and Camilla, intercepted by amateur radio scanners back in 1989, in which the heir to the throne told his married lover he wished he could be reincarnated as her tampon. That's not a paraphrase. That's what he said. The tabloids printed it in full. The visceral, cringing public disgust wasn't just about infidelity. Every tabloid reader already suspected the affair. It was about the sheer absurdity, the vulgarity, the image of the future king whispering something so ridiculous it read like parody. Overnight, any notion that Camilla might someday be accepted by the public seemed genuinely delusional. Elizabeth's position hardened further. She was managing a crisis of institutional credibility, and Camilla was, from the palace's perspective, its source. Diana's death on August 31, 1997, in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris changed the political landscape entirely. But not toward acceptance. Not at first. The extraordinary outpouring of public grief for Diana initially made any association with Camilla even more toxic. Polling from the late 1990s showed deep, consistent public opposition to Camilla. Majorities didn't just object to Camilla becoming queen, they objected to her existence in Charles's public life at all. So Charles's team did something calculated. They hired a fixer. Mark Boland, installed as Charles's deputy private secretary in the late 1990s, was brought in with what multiple sources describe as a specific mandate: rehabilitate Camilla Parker Bowles in the public eye. The press dubbed the effort Operation PB. Boland understood that the rehabilitation couldn't be rushed. Public memory of Diana was too raw, the tabloid hostility too sharp, and the echo of that tampon conversation still too loud. What it could be was methodical, staged, patient, managed one headline at a time. Stage 1 was about visibility, getting the public used to simply seeing Camilla. On January 28, 1999, Charles and Camilla were photographed together leaving the Ritz Hotel in London. This was widely reported as the first time the couple had been seen together in public. It was choreographed. The photographers knew exactly where to stand and when to be there. The image was designed to look candid. It wasn't. Boland's genius was understanding that in the media economy, a photograph repeated enough times stops being shocking and starts being wallpaper. That first Ritz photograph was the beginning of the desensitization campaign. Stage 2. Integration with the family. Camilla met Prince William and Prince Harry in carefully managed settings. Each encounter was calibrated to generate a positive headline, or at least a neutral one, without overplaying the hand. The meetings were kept informal, low pressure, and crucially, they were leaked to sympathetic journalists at precisely the right moment. The message to the public was clear. If Diana's sons can accept this woman, perhaps you can too. Stage 3. Proximity to the Queen herself. In June 2000, Elizabeth and Camilla were both present at a 60th birthday party for the former King Constantine of Greece at Highgrove. This was widely reported as the first time the two had been in the same social setting since the Charles-Camilla relationship became public knowledge. The meeting wasn't accidental. It was staged on neutral social ground, at a private event where a chance encounter could be presented as natural rather than as a concession. No photographs of the two together were released. The point wasn't visual proof. It was the news cycle. The headline that the Queen and Camilla had been in the same room was, by itself, enough to move the needle. Then, in 2002, two things happened within months of each other that blew the doors open. The Queen Mother died on March 30, 2002, at the age of 101. She had been among the fiercest internal opponents of Camilla, reported to have refused to be in the same room as her, viewing the entire situation through the lens of the abdication, as a personal betrayal of everything her husband's reluctant, health-destroying reign had stood for. The Queen Mother's opposition wasn't political. It was existential. Camilla represented a world in which the sacrifice that defined her life, the sacrifice that made her husband king and ultimately killed him, as she saw it, was rendered meaningless. With her death, a generational veto was lifted. The last person in the royal family for whom the 1936 rule was personal, not institutional, was gone. And in July of that same year, the Church of England voted to allow clergy discretion on remarriage. Both barriers. Same year. The polls were shifting too, though slowly. Surveys from the early 2000s routinely showed majorities opposed to Camilla becoming queen. But the trend line was moving in one direction. Opposition was softening. Not because people had changed their minds about the affair, the moral judgment lingered, but because the emotional intensity was fading. Diana's death was 5 years ago, then 8, then 10. Public grief has a half-life, and Boleyn's team knew it. They were running out the clock as much as building goodwill. By the time of the 2005 wedding, opposition had declined measurably, and through the 2000s, as Camilla took on more public duties, charity work, official engagements, the quiet normalcy of a woman doing her job, the numbers continued to shift. Not from rejection to enthusiasm, from rejection to indifference. And indifference, it turned out, was all the institution needed. The Privy Council met on March 2, 2005, to give formal effect to Elizabeth's consent to the marriage under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, the statute that required any descendant of George II to obtain the sovereign's permission to wed. The wedding took place on April 9, 2005, not at Windsor Castle as originally announced, but at Windsor Guildhall, a civic building, after legal complications arose about whether a license granted to the castle for weddings would require it to become a public venue available to any applicant. Elizabeth didn't attend the civil ceremony at the Guildhall. She did attend the service of prayer and dedication afterward at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, and she hosted the reception at Windsor Castle. The message was forensic in its calibration. The sovereign would bless the union but maintain visible distance from the civil mechanics of a marriage that, in Edward's era, would have been constitutionally impossible. Even the title was managed. Camilla would be styled Duchess of Cornwall, not Princess of Wales. Diana's title, too radioactive to touch. And the official palace line was that when Charles became king, Camilla would take the lesser designation, Princess Consort, not Queen Consort. A title specifically invented, with no historical precedent whatsoever, to manage public opinion. Another convention, another made-up rule. That careful ambiguity held for 17 years. Then, Elizabeth destroyed it in a single sentence. On February 5, 2022, the eve of her Platinum Jubilee, marking 70 years on the throne, Elizabeth released a written statement through Buckingham Palace. The key passage? When, in the fullness of time, my son Charles becomes king, I know you will give him and his wife Camilla the same support that you have given me. And it is my sincere wish that, when that time comes, Camilla will be known as Queen Consort. It is my sincere wish. Not permission, not acquiescence. A wish. She wanted it. The woman who'd been 9 years old when the rule about divorced women cost Edward his crown was now, at 95, personally requesting that a divorced woman be called Queen. The 17-year promise of Princess Consort, the carefully crafted compromise designed to soothe the public still mourning Diana, evaporated in a subordinate clause. And the polls, by then, had softened enough that the backlash was manageable. YouGov surveys around this period showed the country essentially split, no longer the overwhelming opposition of the early 2000s, but a divided, exhausted public that had, by and large, stopped caring enough to fight it. That was the window. That was when Elizabeth moved. 7 months later, Elizabeth died. Charles became king on September 8, 2022, and Camilla became Queen Consort, a divorced woman, on the throne. Exactly where the institution had said a divorced woman could never be. So, what actually changed? Not the principle. There was never a principle. What changed was the political calculus. Specific people made specific decisions on specific dates. The Church of England updated its guidance in July 2002 by a vote of 27-1 in the House of Bishops. The Queen Mother died on March 30, 2002, removing the last personal obstacle within the family. Mark Boland ran a rehabilitation campaign through the late 1990s and early 2000s, nicknamed Operation PB, that methodically moved Camilla from pariah to tolerable to accepted, one choreographed photograph at a time. Elizabeth II watched the polls shift, waited until the opposition had softened from furious to fatigued, and then, on February 5, 2022, delivered the final verdict herself. The institution didn't change its mind about a moral question. It changed its strategy about a political one. The church updated a policy, a PR man staged some photographs, a queen read the room, and a rule that had been presented as sacred, eternal, woven into the constitutional fabric of the nation, that rule turned out to be a calculation. Adjustable, situational, disposable when the math changed. And that's what makes Edward VIII's story something worse than tragic. He didn't lose his throne, his country, and his family's respect because of an immovable principle. He lost them because of a political judgment call that the next generation simply made differently. Same institution, same church, same family, different math. The doctrine that Archbishop Lang wielded like holy fire in 1936 was quietly revised by a committee vote in 2002, and nobody lost anything. Nobody was exiled. Nobody was stripped of their title or denied their dignity. Nobody was financially squeezed into selling their homes at a loss, or denied jewels they believed were rightfully theirs, or told the woman they loved wasn't worthy of 3 letters before her name. The price Edward paid, the exile, the diminished title, the 36 years in Paris, the petty cruelties over property and money and protocol, was extracted by an institution that knew, even then, that the rule was a choice. They chose to enforce it against him. They chose not to enforce it against Charles. There's a bitter echo in all of it. Almost a century later, another royal chose an American woman and found himself on the outside looking in. The Duke of Windsor, the Duke of Sussex. Different decades, same architecture of exile. But Edward never got to see the answer to his question. He died in Paris on May 28, 1972. Wallis never received the HRH that was denied her in 1937, and the doctrine that was supposedly too sacred to bend for a king turned out to be a policy, revised by a show of hands, abandoned when a prince needed it to be, and discarded completely when a 95-year-old queen decided the political moment was finally right. That's not a principle. That's administration. Subscribe for more stories like this.